Very warm welcome to all of you here on a Sunday morning. It's great to have you here, as well as the folks that are following us on live streaming all around the world. As most of you know, this is the UN, we're going to start soon, the United Nations Decade for Ecosystem Restoration. And that is actually in parallel with the UN Decade for Family Farming that's already started. And all of these were on our way to try to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. This is going to call for transformation of our landscapes. This is not planting trees here or there or cleaning up a few water spills somewhere, but it's about shifting the trajectory of economic development toward inclusive green growth, and landscapes are where that starts. As landscape stakeholders are coming together across their sectors, across their groups, to consider what that future will look like, what their vision is, what is their collective action plan going to look like, they're coming up with the development of something we're calling a landscape investment portfolio. There's not one or two or three sustainable investments that are needed in a landscape. It's 200 or 300 or more in large landscapes, and they're in every sector. You need sustainable energy, sustainable agriculture, sustainable water management, sustainable forests, sustainable infrastructure, sustainable human settlements. And all of these are going to need to be mobilized financing. The situation that we're in right now is that even very organized landscape partnerships face a huge hurdle to mobilize the financing for these investments. The transaction costs are enormous, they're very mismatched with available funding, and it's kind of a mess. As a result of that, there has been an incredible period, the last few years, of innovation in the area of landscape finance. The first set of things that we saw start to crop up were what we're calling landscape finance support services. This is bringing in different groups who could make it possible to build these landscape investment portfolios, find the synergies, find the financial actors. And you see a couple of different kinds of actors in this. You have the ones that I call project readiness, some of the incubators that are coming in to help businesses and enterprises who have a landscape lens to what they're doing. You're also seeing coordinators who are coming in who can help put together a landscape program. You're seeing landscape developers, groups like BirdLife or groups, there's so many of them now, the Landscape Finance Lab, that are supporting landscapes to develop investment plans. And this is all extremely exciting. You're also seeing some of the partnerships themselves reach out, bring in financial partners into their partnership who can help them build this landscape investment portfolio. But we're even moving beyond that. We're starting to see now a new generation of landscape finance vehicles that are put in place explicitly to fund multiple sector, multi-objective activities at a landscape scale, intentionally in a coordinated way. And a couple of us just came from a meeting of the Coalition for Private Investment and Conservation in Amsterdam a few days ago, and a group that has been working there on landscapes and seascapes has been reviewing these models and came up with actually 5 different sets of models that are coming up. Some of them are targeted landscape investment funds for a specific landscape, like Naivasha in Kenya, or for multiple landscapes that can apply for funds from there. We have development finance development finance institutions like the European Investment Bank that have started to invest intentionally in integrated landscape management. We have one real landscape bond. A lot of them call themselves landscape bonds, but there's really only one that we've been able to find that does multiple sector investments in a coordinated way in a landscape. We're also seeing specialized investor services arise, where some philanthropic foundations look at their investments and say, we need our investments to follow our mission objectives, and we're going to target our program-related investments in those places. We're also seeing individual wealthy people who want to see their investments in a particular landscape that they love. So we're seeing a couple of these kinds of things. And the last model that we identified was a new phenomenon, which is a landscape development company, which goes in and for a profit helps, and as a partial investor in investments in the landscape, come to help the landscape partnerships. So there's all this innovation going on, and we wanted to take a bit of time today to give you a taste of what that looks like. And we have 4 magnificent panelists to do this for us. The first person who's going to speak is Brina Griffin. She's a very experienced person who's now the head of BirdLife International's forestry program, and she's going to talk to us about their new accelerator, which is one of those landscape investment support services. You can, by the way, find full bios on these amazing people if you go to the GLF website, so I won't use our time now for that. Second to speak is going to be Eva Meyerhofer, who comes from the European Investment Bank, which has been one of the great innovators in this space. And she's going to give us some of the examples of how a development finance institution can, in fact, make these kinds of investments. The third person is Hector Martinez, who is an entrepreneur and investor from Mexico, who's been involved in he has a history of working in innovative finance and is now putting his attention on building a landscape regeneration fund for Mesoamerica. And finally, we have Bastian Luhmann, who's from Topham Olsen International, who has been working on the development of the landscape assessment financial flows tool, so that people in landscapes can actually understand the finance which is available in the landscape and how they need to influence it. So with no further ado, I would like to go ahead and ask Brina to give us a little bit of an introduction to that accelerator. No, this one right there is fine. You can stand up if you, yeah.
Hello. Hi. Good morning, everyone. So thanks, Sarah. I am Brina Griffin. I'm from BirdLife International, and I like to say that BirdLife is probably the biggest conservation NGO you've never heard of, because actually BirdLife is 121 independent conservation organizations, each of them usually working at national scale all around the world, so in roughly 118 countries. And BirdLife is actually, as the name would imply, focused on bird conservation, but we actually do a lot more than bird conservation. We have a big science team that works on the Red List for birds, and we also are the secretariat for the Key Biodiversity Alliance. And we also work with our partners. So I work for the Secretariat of BirdLife, and my role is to work with partners to help them achieve their conservation goals in their countries. And so we do that through technical support, fundraising support, a whole range of different things. And so from the forest perspective, we took a look at all of our partners and what they were doing, what their priorities were, and we saw a common theme. A lot of them were working at landscape scale, and many of them had made investments in these landscapes for decades, some of them up to 30 years working in the same landscape on conservation. And over that time, they developed the networks with local communities, they developed various programs, they developed, oftentimes they'd been involved in setting up a conservation or a protected area. And so they had a lot of components that they had been working on, and the next question was, how are they going to sustain this work? So how are you going to keep the trees standing in these conservation areas or protected areas? How are you going to ensure that the local communities that you've been working with to develop better livelihoods are able to then take that forward and manage those small businesses themselves? And this was really the challenge, this landscape scale sustainability challenge. And so we also have a partnership with Wildlife Conservation Society and the Worldwide Fund for Nature UK, so WWF UK, called Trillion Trees. And through this, we saw that they were also, their field programs and country partners were facing some of the similar challenges. So we decided to create an accelerator. And really, an accelerator is kind of a jargony term. You hear it a lot. What does it mean? An accelerator is really actually quite simple. It's a cohort-based program, meaning you bring a group of people or a group of teams together, and you define that team as a cohort. And then together, you provide mentoring, training, usually seed funding of some sort, and you provide an opportunity for them to learn from each other and learn from experts, and then to communicate what they're doing to a broader audience. So that's what we're doing. Currently, we just launched this year our pilot year of the accelerator. And it's really for 5 BirdLife teams right now working on 5 landscapes. And what we're seeing is that this enables them to see commonalities across the different landscapes on the challenges that they're facing. And really, the kind of nut that we're trying to crack is on this finance question. And so how do we pull the different streams of financing that are available and funding? So we look at financing as often sort of private investment, and funding is public or philanthropic investment. So how do we pull the financing and the funding streams together within the landscape, and at the same time maintain that conservation perspective, so that biodiversity, the aims of biodiversity and forest conservation, and in many cases restoration as well. So that's what we're working on, and I'm really excited to hear what everyone else is working on as well.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. Eva, over to you.
Good morning. I'm Eva Over, and I work for the European Investment Bank, and I lead the biodiversity agenda within the institution. I'm coming at it at a slightly different angle in the sense that we as a large financing institution, we finance primarily projects. And we have, as Sarah Kyrie said, been quite innovative in this sector in trying to finance and support the financing or leveraging financing for biodiversity conservation. However, these are small, still very nascent projects on tools, and their impact is not at scale. So how do you actually look at scale? How do you try to get that impact that you're trying to get, and getting all sectors of the economy and of the population involved in that? And actually, financing at scale, at landscape level, is the only way to go. But this is a problem that doesn't affect only the conservation sector, it's certainly the infrastructure sector, and we're seeing that also in cities as well as in rural areas. And one project, or 2 projects that I would like to just refer to, is one that is actually around the corner, is the whole Emscher renaturalization project, where we as an institution looked at financing different sectors within this project. We looked at the wastewater treatment sector. We financed actually restoration of the catchment area using different funding mechanisms, some of it debt, looking at funds, equity, but also what happened was that whole project, we included it in our sustainability awareness bonds. So that's how we generated capital for the project. Just a quick note is that this particular project, actually landscape program, started in 2006 and was initiated by the local regional authorities together with NGOs, civil society, and they started planning in 2006. It started materializing in 2016, and we're seeing the impacts now in 2019. So you are in it for the long term. And this is, I think, the biggest challenge, especially for the private sector, is that it is long term. It's not short term. And especially when you're dealing with governments and with the private sector that have a certain short termism, you need to incorporate that in order to see the impacts. The other aspect that I wanted to mention is under the Natural Capital Financing Facility, which is a facility that we have established together with the European Commission. And in it, we have one particular project that is of interest, where we're financing the resilience and climate adaptation plan for the city of Athens. And there we are looking at different opportunities of integrating grey and green infrastructure using nature-based solutions. This is, again, long-term, but what it did, it involved all stakeholders, from civil society to the local citizens, to the planners, to the different sectors and ministries within within the administration. And it's all coming together because they bring different skills to the table, they bring different interests, and the problem is that with conservation and the ecosystem services that they support, or biodiversity and the ecosystem services they support, they don't have boundaries by sector. They cross those boundaries. So we have to bring absolutely all the stakeholders together. Also, in order to manage the conflicts, because we all have different interests, and manage those interests and the expectations.
Thank you very much, Eva. Let's pass it over to Hector. Thank you. Okay.
Hello, thank you.
Give us.
Hello. Thank you for
ahead.
having us here. To tell you a little bit about what I do, let me make a little history. I started an impact investing fund about 6 years ago. It was a fund designed to help small farmers within Mexico. And to help small farmers anywhere in the world, you have to build up scale. So what we did is develop a business model, an investment model, in which we talk to the different communities, to the different farmer groups, and we associate hundreds or thousands of small farmers in order to build up scale and volume. And we invest everything, all the capital needed for these small farmers, not only to produce better, be certified in it, and be able to export, but also we invest in all the industrial platform, meaning packaging plants, process plants, and then we get out and allocate these new products into the global markets. How we do it is we invest 100% of the money needed to actually not only start up the companies, we seed the capital, we incubate, we accelerate, we build up scale. We do everything basically with private equity. We associate in these new projects directly, legally, with the group of small farmers. We give up or give away or concede 10% of the equity of the shares of these new projects, of these new companies, to our partners, to the small farmers. And between 8 to 12 years, throughout dividends, throughout the profits of these companies, their 10% buys our 90%. So over time, they end up getting these large new companies. It's been proven quite successful in Mexico, and that was 6 years ago. Right now in Mexico, we work with over 8 to 1,000 small farmers. These projects are going to grow to probably 3,000 to 4,000 smallholders. And last year, I was invited to Costa Rica by Sarah and her team, and I got introduced into landscapes, and I fell absolutely in love with it because it makes sense. When you work farming and then forestry and then bees, and then it just makes sense to think about the landscape itself. Because if you work with a single industry, it will very probably end up cannibalizing or eating up the rest of what can be done within a landscape, and it's not good for the landscape itself. So last year, I sold Paisano, the first fund, and now we're structuring the second fund. The second fund is going to be a landscape-oriented fund, meaning we're going to take the landscape itself and make it the beneficiary of all the investments we make. Based on the same model, we're going to add up a little bit of debt to it, because most of these companies need a lot of working capital. That's just useless to do with equity. But if you take the landscape and make it the beneficiary, then you can design on a state-of-the-art with a state-of-the-art view and with a systemic approach to it, meaning you can just take a look at the landscape at probably 110,000 feet and figure out what this landscape needs. And once you actually know what the landscape needs in terms of productive projects or profitable projects, conservation efforts, you can put together, you can sit on the table with everyone, meaning communities locally, governments, local, federal, NGOs, banks, and everyone. You can sit on the table with all the stakeholders and discuss the landscape and figure out what to do with everyone's point of view, and you can actually build something, but you need everyone together.
Thank you so much, and let's pass, very much. Okay. Go right ahead, boss. This is where we need the one slide.
Hi, I'm Bas Lohman. From Topham Olsen. In Topham Olsen, we slightly different. We don't have money. We look at people that do and try and see how they behave. So we do have some money, of course, and we're running a project at the moment from funded by the Foreign Affairs Ministry in the Netherlands, in 7 landscapes, and we run that together with partners of the Topham Olsen network. And we're looking for sustainable landscapes that are also climate resilient. In defining then what is sustainability, we found that if we have only a project, which is only 5 years, we heard already, it's a long-term venture to actually get to sustainability, then we need to build the capacities in that landscape to actually work towards sustainability. So for us, we focus then on 2 main issues that in the landscapes. One is good governance, so we're trying to help them create good governance through their multi-stakeholder platforms in connection to local authorities. The other one is inclusive finance. If we hear now there's people outside, they're looking for projects, they want to help landscapes, want to invest in landscapes. There's people in landscapes, they say, okay, we have good ideas, we want to actually some money to implement those ideas. Then there's very often difficult to match them, but in addition, they're forgetting something. Because once you start investing in there, the landscape is not empty. There's people there, there's relations there already, and those relations very often are influenced by money already flowing into those landscapes. So in this new project that we're starting, one of the first things we want to do is actually identify which are those flows. But we don't have much money for that. We don't have a lot of researchers that can go into there. Also the landscapes are relatively poor in data, so we have to have a simple methodology to actually analyze that, and it needs to be analyzed by the multi-stakeholder platform. So together with eco-agriculture partners, we developed what we call the landscape analysis financial flows, where a preliminary result you can see here on the screen. And the interesting thing is that we actually find, confirm basically, which a lot of literature is also saying, there are different types of funding going in there. There's actually a contradiction in there as well, because on the one hand you have a lot of government funds going in there, but you have much more private funds, and a lot of that going through the banks. And we in there at the moment we find that the bank in this particular landscape, for example, manages more than 10 times as much money as the government agents together do. In addition, they address different people. The government looks more at groups, at communities, at parks, looks at the ecosystem services as well. The bank goes to more the private sector. Companies, also individual farmers, but for example, very few farmer groups nor communities, and if they go to communities indirectly. At the same time, and you can see that on the right-hand top side of the slide, their investment have different profiles. If you look at the impacts, in this case, we asked different focal groups to actually qualify the impact of the financial flows that they knew about. Then if you look at those perceived impacts, you see that the government funds basically score quite well, the blue bars there. They score well in economic, in biodiversity, in social, and then particularly in relation to strengthening organization aspects. They score well in relation to food security, water security, and also in terms of mitigation. And if you then ask them to look at the impacts of the bank, then there's only a positive impact on the economics. Yeah? So we see that they're very different profiles. There's much more going in things that actually degrade the landscape than there's going into things that help restore or maintain the landscape. So there you have here a serious problem, yeah, and what we want with this type of analysis, that the multiple stakeholder platforms, they actually can identify that kind of contradictions within their landscape, yeah, in order for them to decide on where should investments be made. Yeah, and is there really, in this case, a need for more money? Or is there a need to change the impact that the money that's already going into the landscape, yeah, to change the impact that it has?
Thank you so much. I'd like to ask, very much, good. I'd like to ask a couple of follow-up questions. Brina, you're a conservation organization from a long time. You're an NGO. What do you think is the long-term role of NGOs in this mobilization of finance?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I was thinking about it even just during the last few presentations, because traditionally conservation NGOs have been involved in conservation, so focusing on the conserved areas, the protected areas, the ecosystem services, how we maintain them, monitoring the science and research. So that's really our core work. But increasingly in the landscapes that we're working in almost the kind of a gap area in this model that was just presented. So we're working to create sustainable livelihoods, and by sustainable, we think sustainable means, you know, sustainable for the production and for the communities and the farmers, but also sustainable for the biodiversity. And it's a kind of a weird place for a conservation organization to be working. In a lot of our landscapes, we're actually trading in products because we can market products and get a premium price, or we're working directly with businesses, we're exporting products on behalf of farmers. So it's a weird place, and I think that there's, to answer the question briefly, I think that there's actually a role for new kinds of entrepreneurs to be able to come in and fill that role that currently some of our conservation organizations are doing.
I think we were seeing that in our review of models, that those are just starting to come up with various things. Hector, you also mentioned this importance of the platforms. Tell us why you as an investor think that's really important.
I think it was for me, yeah.
I was going first to Hector, and then I'll come back to you.
I'm sorry. Well, if you, when you evaluate a project from the financial perspective, there's really only two variables you take a look at: time and risk. And the cost of money is basically that. It's the evaluation of time and risk. When you talk about landscapes and conservation and these kind of projects, I mean, you can't just make the tree grow faster, or I mean, time is a given. You have to give the landscape and the conservation efforts, and a lot of these projects need these 8 to 15 years to actually make a profit. So time, it's kind of out of the table. The only thing you have left to evaluate as an investor is risk. And if you go into a landscape and the communities, the government and the NGOs and everyone in there is just not talking to each other, or they disagree on their view of what the landscape should be, you as an investor see a tremendous amount of risk. And those are non-investable landscapes, basically. When you go into a landscape and everyone agrees on what should be done, and they all agree on what projects are supposed to be there, and everyone is on board with philanthropic money. This all has to be blended finance. I mean, the government has to pitch in, NGOs have to pitch in with whatever they can do, and the private sector, the private money, or the investors have to pitch in as well. So if everyone is talking and everyone agrees, risk goes down dramatically, and these projects become investable projects.
Thank you very much, Hector. Eva, you also have a take on that, sitting in a slightly different financial position.
Yeah, I think as a financial institution, what we need to be doing more of is targeting the enablers in order to unlock that green finance. And it's a broad range of stakeholders, and as Hector rightly mentioned, it's from civil society organizations, conservation organizations, up to government levels. So we need to be able to, get to define standards, certification, metrics for the planners. You would need to offer, philanthropic NGOs or philanthropic organizations to offer technical assistance to build up that capacity. That capacity is not there today. To be able to understand what a landscape offers, to be able to internalize environmental externalities, to understand what the benefits are to the different sectors and segments of the population. And also then for policymakers to deploy incentivizing policy instruments to which we can contribute and certainly assist there. We have a role to play as a multilateral development bank in those policy instruments. And then, of course, at a corporate level, promote corporate social responsibility, make it, a reporting requirement that will also provide the carrots and the sticks. So basically, you need to provide those sets of instruments in order to bring all the stakeholders and incentivize them to continue investing in the landscape.
Thank you very much. Bas, let me ask you, after you do a LAF study, landscape assessment of financial flows, so what? What can happen after that?
Actually, I would first like another comment, because actually I'm a bit sorry that we don't work in Mesoamerica, because I think we would be a great match, really. Like what you're saying, but that's where we would like to work in, link it up to impact investors. So that's also what we actually trying to do here, that this is like a first step to do that. Yeah, we need to know the landscape. That's also what you refer to. Yeah, we need to know the landscape, but not just we, Topham Olsen, we're talking about we. Yeah, we are part then of the multi-stakeholder platform. So this is a first step. Based on it, we're going to analyze which are the actors that we could actually work with where we might have an impact on that. I already mentioned in this case, the banks have a lot of money. Yeah, actually the government is in this particular case supporting the bank to give inclusive, to make finance more inclusive, to give loans at low interest rates. But we see that a lot of that apparently doesn't have the desired impacts. Yeah, so maybe work with the bank on ESG criteria, implementing that in their loans. Yeah, but we also see that there's a need for these different actors to actually work together. Yeah, one of the problems we had in the implementation of this is that not all actors were prepared to actually participate. Yeah, so that is also a gap. Yeah, we need to strengthen that multi-stakeholder platform. We found that LAF actually is not so much a tool to get a lot of information, because a lot of information isn't there in those countries, but it is an information in making them more aware and actually strengthening the multi-stakeholder platform. So the next step would then be to actually, having identified the areas, define strategies to either change the finance or get more finance in there. Yeah.
That sounds great. Very interesting. We have only a few minutes left, and maybe we have time for 2 questions from the audience, if you may have. And I'm going to let my folks with the microphone. There's one right here. Please be extremely brief. And we've been given an extra 5 minutes over because we started late. But we'll ask our panelists to respond. And please identify yourself.
Yes, thank you very much. Axel Michael Over from Perspectives and the University of Zurich. My question would relate to the mechanisms that we see under the Paris Agreement for financing, so both results-based financing and market mechanisms under Article 6. Which role would you as panelists see for those mechanisms?
Thank you. Another question? Anyone else? There's one over here, a lady over here. Identify yourself.
My name is Ning Li. I work for IUCN. I have a question about data and technology. It seems to me that in order to make long-term beneficial investment, that is the basis for any decision. So I would like to know, and particularly from our colleague from Mexico, what are the technology or data management systems that you have been using to ensure that the benefit in the long term? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we'll let the group, who would like to respond to the first one about the mechanisms for the Paris Agreement? Brina? Yeah.
So I think, from our perspective, one of the biggest challenges when it comes to financing sustainability and conservation is that currently there are really no ways to fund conservation. There's no ways to invest in conservation. There's no way to invest in biodiversity and get a return. And so we're trying to solve this problem of how do you integrate a financial system that's based on returns and make it work for things that currently aren't integrated into the economic system. And so I think to your point about climate mechanisms, one of the opportunities is that it does, in perhaps imperfect ways, and there's a lot of governance issues which we've talked about in previous sessions, but it does offer an opportunity to put a value to ecosystem service, in this case carbon, in standing forests and in restoration and in better practices on farms. And so it does actually go some way to solving this really difficult issue of the underpinning of financing ecosystem services and biodiversity in sustainable landscapes.
Thank you. Eva, do you want to add, or one of you want to add?
Yeah.
Let Eva go first.
Very briefly, I mean, this has been a challenge, especially under the Natural Capital Financing Facility that we found, and the only way, the entry point we have seen in order to support biodiversity and ecosystem services is to integrate it into existing infrastructure projects. So, for example, my example of the city of Athens is you're looking at sustainable infrastructure, making sure that the definition of sustainable infrastructure includes the integration of green infrastructure into grey infrastructure, or looking at other mechanisms where you are looking at the integration of nature-based solutions in a wider, in a global landscape. And that is the entry point. Adaptation is finding the same problems that biodiversity conservation is that there are no acceptable returns at the moment, and it's very difficult to finance climate adaptation. So those vehicles have to be looked at in a much more integrated way, and probably as a add-on to existing projects or instruments.
Thank you. You wanted to add something brief? Mm-hmm.
I think you're talking about things that already can be done, but I think also you have to go think beyond that, and we really need to think about new landscape funds, or finance, which actually can invest also in ecosystem services, because ecosystem services, a lot of the, especially smallholder farmers, they depend on those ecosystem services. Yeah, but they're not the ones that actually can determine whether those services are being maintained or not. Yeah, so you need to be able to finance the landscape in such a way that you can finance both the production and the ecosystem services on which the production depends. Yeah, I don't have the solution for that, but that I think is the way that you have to start thinking.
Great. Maybe we'll pass over to Hector for just a moment. If you could respond to the metrics question, the measurement one, but if you have another thought.
Yeah, well, regarding impact and sustainability goals, what we do is we use IRIS as a standard
Can you explain
KPI.
the acronym?
Oh?
Do you know the acronym for IRIS?
Yeah.
The full name?
The IRIS, I have no clue.
Mm-hmm.
It's a long thing, but it's a battery of KPIs that measures sustainability and social impact and environmental impact and all sorts of impact. But we do try to use certain IRIS KPIs, and then we go to the UNO global goals. That's for measuring impact. We do use a common platform, Oracle platform, for managing data and day-to-day operations. We usually, every 2 years, we hire or we retain a large consulting company to run a global market research on a certain amount of fresh products that we either are under our portfolio or will be within the next 2 years or 5. So we keep an eye on what's going on.
Great, thank you very much. There's much more that we could all say about that. I think it is a period of great innovation right now, also on the metrics. We're working with Landscale. I just was in a session that had several of those kind of data managements. EcoAg is working on a platform for managing landscapes, so I think it's a great, pertinent question. Did you want to add something else? We can go back to the very brief.
Only just that I just wanted to give a shout out. There are actually quite a few startups that are here at the conference that presented yesterday that I went to their presentations looking at different technologies for assessing restoration and progress in different ways. So there are actually people here, developing new ways of gathering that data.
Okay, great. What I'd like to do is give each of our panelists 30 seconds to pass on any key message that they would like to have you all take away. Brian, I'll start with you.
Sure. So I think the key message, and I've heard it from a bunch of us, is that really in order to achieve sustainable landscapes, in order to finance sustainable landscapes, we need to figure out how to integrate the core of sustainability, which is the ecosystem services that underpin it, into those finance mechanisms. And we don't necessarily, we're trying different ways of doing that, but we haven't quite solved that yet. So it's a challenge for all of us to think creatively about how we can integrate those really important values, because if we're just focusing on the production and forgetting the protection, it's not really sustainable landscape.
Great. Just go right down the line.
Okay, I think we need greater dialogue between GLF, for example, and the GIN network, I think. Yeah, you have to really talk to the impact investors. We have one here. Yeah, but you said you were the only Mexican. I was wondering where you might also be the only impact investor here at the moment. But I heard already you're not the only Mexican, so I have hope there's other impact investors.
Thank you. Eva?
Sorry, keep on switching out. I would like to just complement what Brina said is absolutely important, is we need the metrics, we need to understand the impacts, and we tend to, we forget that. We need to understand the trade-offs between socioeconomic development and conservation, but in order to do that and to understand that, we need to start valuing, and we don't do that.
Thank you. Hector?
Well, really two messages. First, build up your platforms within your landscapes. It's really, really, really important. Second, within the conservation ecosystem, please start talking money. And within the private investing and the private banking, we need to start speaking conservation. We don't speak the same language, and we need to, because the world needs it.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you. There is going to be a Global Landscapes Forum investment case activity in Luxembourg later this year, and hopefully at next year's Global Landscapes Forum, we'll be able to have a panel with actual landscape investment funds taken apart to see how they were set up, and hopefully that will happen. Thank you all very much, and thanks particularly for all of our panelists.